and that is letter D. So here's an easier way in computing 14-9. So this will bridge the second classification to the third classification. So you have AR, AP. Beginning balance for AR is 2 million debit side. Ending balance is on the credit side amounting to 4 million. Beginning balance for accounts payable is 3 million. Ending balance is 1.5 million. And you're given with the additional information. Cash basis income 6 million. Now remember, under cash basis of accounting, income is recorded when cash is received. That means this 6 million is a cash receipts. So if you're going to relate it between AR and AP, you can most likely relate it with AR. Cash receipt meaning cash collection. Okay. So what would be the journal entry if you have AR collection? That would be debit, cash, credit, AR. So if you'll notice, for every cash receipt, AR is credited. That's why we put 6 million on the credit side of AR. Now the question asks us to compute for the income under accrual basis of accounting. So we recognize income, we debit AR, credit revenue. That means if we're looking at the income, the amount of the income, then we look at the debit side. So from this we can now solve. You have 6 million plus 4 million plus 3 million minus 2 million minus 1.5 million. That will give you 9,500,000, reflecting the revenue under accrual basis of accounting. For me, this is much easier than the other method. This is what I call the double T account. So we'll move on to the next classification of problems using the double T account. So we start with 14-1. You have Zeta company. So you have two accounts involved. You have AR and advances from customers. So what is advances from customers? Advances from customers is a liability account. It's a deferral account. It's when you receive money from customers but haven't delivered the goods or the services yet. So this is a liability account. And then we plot the given data. So debit, AR beginning balance 1 million, credit, AR ending balance 1.3 million. Advances from customers is a liability account, so we credit 200,000 as beginning balance, debit 300,000 ending balance. And then you have a write-off amounting to 50,000, so write-off is on the credit side. Now there's additional given. You have allowance for uncollectible accounts. As I have said before, it would not be necessary in this problem because the written off accounts has been given already. However, if this is not given, then you'd have to compute this using the T account for allowance for doubtful accounts. But because this is given, then we'll disregard allowance for doubtful accounts. And the Zeta company reported sales revenue of 4,600,000. So what would be the journal entry if there's a sales revenue? Debit AR, credit sales. So if you will notice, AR is credited for every sales. At the same time, if you receive money in advance, okay, so you debit cash, credit, advances from customers. However, once you deliver them, once you earn them, you recognize a revenue. Debit, advances from customers, credit, sales, or revenue. So if you will notice, if you recognize sales or revenue, these accounts are debited. But if you collect cash for AR, that's debit, cash, credit, AR. If you collect money, these accounts are credited. So given here is the sales revenue of 4,600,000. So if there's a sales, you will notice that these accounts are debited. So we put 4,600,000 on the debit side. The question is, under cash basis, what amount should be reported as sales revenue for the current year? So, sales revenue under the cash basis is equivalent to cash collection, because under cash basis of accounting, we record income or revenue when cash is received. So, it refers to cash collection. So, if you will notice in our journal entries, every time it involves cash, these accounts are credited. That would mean we are looking at a credit balance. So, that's 1 million plus 4,600,000 plus 300,000 minus 50,000 minus 1.3 million minus 200,000. That will give you 4,350,000. Letter B. Letter B. So this is what I call a double T account. So, you can normally use this for prepayments and accruals, deferrals, and accruals. Next is problem 14-17, Clay Company. So again, you have two accounts. You have prepaid interest, as I have said, a prepayment. And then you have interest payable, an accrual. So, as I have said before, it involves a prepayment, an accrual, or a deferral, or unearned, and an accrued expense. So, in this case, you have a prepayment, and then you have accrued expense. So, beginning balance for prepaid interest, you have 23,500 debit. Ending balance is 18,000. Interest payable is 45,000 credit, beginning balance. Ending balance is 53,500. And now you're given with 100,000 payment. Take note, that's cash paid. So question is, where do we put this one? On the credit side or on the debit side? So the best way to do it is to imagine what would be your journal entry if you pay in advance for interest. So that is debit prepaid interest and credit cash. If you'll notice, prepaid interest is debited. If you want to confirm, just think, what would be the journal entry if you pay an interest payable? So debit interest payable, credit cash. So if you will notice, both accounts are on the debit side. That would mean this 100,000 should be written on the debit side. So the question is, what amount of interest expense? So we're looking at an expense. So of course, it follows, okay, it should be on the opposite side, expense. But if you're going to analyze it, okay, if there's a prepayment, what would be the adjusting entry to recognize an expense? It would be debit expense, credit prepaid interest. So, if there's an expense, prepaid interest is credited. Now, if you talk about interest payable, if you're liable to pay interest but you haven't paid them yet as of the end of the year, then you debit interest expense, credit accrued, or interest payable. So if you will notice, you have every time you have expenses, the accounts are credited. That would mean if the question relates to expenses, then you're looking for the credit balance. So to solve, 23,500 plus 100,000 plus 53,500 minus 18,000 minus 45,000, you will have 114,000. That is letter D. Next is 14-21, Tara Company. So you have two accounts, rent receivable and unearned rent income. So one is an accrual, accrued income, the other one is a deferral. So beginning balance for rent receivable is 960,000. It's an asset, so it's on the debit side. Ending balance is 1,240,000. For unearned rental income, it is a liability account, so beginning balance is on the credit side, 3.2 million. Ending balance is 2,400,000. And then here you have a write-off amounting to 500,000. So write-off, written off account will be written on the credit side of the receivable account. And then you have 8 million cash receipt. Okay. So question, where do we put 8 million, on the debit side or on the credit side? So as I have said, imagine receiving 8 million. If you have a rent receivable and you collected 8 million, or you collected something, what would be the journal entry? Debit cash, credit rent receivable. Okay. Or if you want to relate it with unearned rent income, you received cash in advance, what would be the journal entry? Debit cash, credit unearned rent income. So if you will notice, every time cash is involved, these accounts are credited. That means 8 million should be written on the credit side because it relates to a cash receipt. Since we're looking at for rental revenue, it follows we can locate it on the opposite side. But if you want to have an analysis, if you recognize revenue, the journal entry would be debit rent receivable credit revenue. Or if you want to relate it with unearned rental income, and you were able to provide the services, that would be a debit to unearned rental income credit revenue. So if you'll notice, if you're looking for a revenue, these accounts are debited. That would mean you can find the revenue here on the debit side. So you compute for the balancing figure, that's 500,000 plus 1,240,000 plus 3.2 million plus 8 million minus 960,000 minus 2.4 million. That will give you 9,580,000 letter. That's letter B. Again, just to remind you, this formula or method is not mandatory. You can follow any methods you're comfortable with. The next problem, we move on to the final classification, those problems which require